Hello everyone and welcome to another video, and you've guessed it, we're going to go through another AlphaZero Stockfish 8 game. In this video, AlphaZero is white once again versus Stockfish 8 who's playing black, and of course AlphaZero starts off with one knight to f3, Stockfish plays knight to f6 this time, and of course AlphaZero starts with their flexible system of c4, leading to a solid and flexible game for white. Black plays e6 here, knight c3 he's played, d5 undermining c4, but now AlphaZero plays d4 and Stockfish opts for a solid setup with c6, and here AlphaZero plays quite an attacking move, bishop g5 pinning the knight, bishop e7 is played and e3 now from AlphaZero, and here Stockfish attacks the bishop on g5 with h6. Now usually in these type of positions white plays bishop to h4, which is the more natural move, keeping on this diagonal, and typically play continues such as knight bd7, bishop d3 and castles. White can play moves like rook c1 and d takes c4, bishop takes c4, b5, bishop d3 and a6, and these are all typical moves in the opening, c5 and a4. So these are the most common moves that are played in this opening. But AlphaZero doesn't play bishop h4 here, in fact they play bishop to f4. But you'll see later this move actually combines well with white's attack. So here Stockfish now castles, queen c2 is played by AlphaZero, knight bd7 is played, and AlphaZero now plays a really aggressive move. Can you spot this? They actually played g4 here, threatening to play g5. Now I really like this move because I think we all could see ourselves playing such a move in a game, such an aggressive move. So I guess we've got to ask the question first, what happens if black captures this pawn on g4? Well, rook g1 is just incredibly strong and black shouldn't take on g4. Of course if knight gf6 here, white can just take on h6 and already has a busted game. If they decide to protect the knight with a move like h5, white doesn't really care, they can just castle queenside calmly, and after a move like king h8, h3 attacking the knight, it gets kicked away, and white can now just start playing aggressive moves like rook g5, attacking h5, and if a move like, let's say g6, just continue developing with bishop d3, and sacrifices on g6 are coming up. White's going to double rooks on a g-file, and the sacrifice pawn has a lot of compensation. Black really doesn't want to go into this. Instead here now Stockfish takes on c4 with d takes c4. And black's plan is now simple, they just want to play moves like knight d5 here, b5 and also bishop b7 to try and sort of counteract this g4 move and exert some pressure on the a8 to h1 diagonal, which is of course weakened by g4. So there are a few moves here that AlphaZero could play now. Bishop takes c4 is an option, but of course now we get into Stockfish's plan. They can play b5, and once the bishop drops back, play moves like bishop b7. Let's say white plays rook g1, but now black can just play b4, after knight to e4, play moves like c5, and black's actually got a nice game. The position is given as equal, so white doesn't really have much of an attack here. g5 was also an option that AlphaZero could have played in that position. H takes g5 would most likely follow, followed by bishop takes g5. But again I think black equalises with b5 here. And white still has sacrificed a pawn. I feel like white is still doing quite well, but the position is given as equal again. Rook g1 might follow, but AlphaZero had a different move in mind. Straight away they just played rook g1 in this position, just following up the attack and preparing maybe g5 straight away. So Stockfish now moves their knight to d5 to get out of the way of this g5 move that's pending. But AlphaZero now plays it straight away anyway, g5, threatening g takes h6 with massive threats along the g-file. If black now captures on g5, white can recapture with the knight, and if bishop takes, just bishop takes, and white's got a nice attack coming. If f6, of course just bishop h6, rook f7 defends the g7 pawn, but now white can just calmly play bishop takes c4. And they have a really nice game. They can just castle queenside and obviously double on the g-file with the two rooks. It's going to be quite hard for black to defend that. After g5 though, black plays knight takes f4, so taking the bishop off. And now AlphaZero plays quite an incredible move. Most players here will play e takes f4, just recapturing, but no, AlphaZero sacrifices a piece and plays g takes h6, carrying on the attack. Very brave indeed. So black's just won a piece, but now they've got to defend their position, which might be very hard to do. Knight g6 was given as an option here, but actually after rook takes g6, f takes and queen takes, they're threatening mate on g7. There's two moves to defend this. Rook f7 is one of them. So if rook f7, white can play h7 check, and if king h8, just queen takes f7, and of course if in this position, if king f8, we're just gonna get a queen with h8, and that's checkmate. So after knight g6, again captures, bishop f6 is a way to defend as well, but knight g5 can be played, threatening queen h7 mate, and if rook f7 to defend the g7 pawn, again h7, and black's just lost. For instance, king h8, knight takes f7 is checkmate. So knight g6 is no good. So the best defence for black is what Stockfish played actually, and that's knight h5, so it moves the knight away from f4 and also protects the g7 pawn. And now AlphaZero captures on g7 with the pawn, threatening to take the rook on f8. If a move like rook e8 to cower away from white's attack and use the g7 pawn to their advantage, white can just continue with bishop takes c4, so they've gained their pawn back. And after b5, just bishop b3. And if moves like bishop f6, white can just simply castle and just double on the g-file. And if black starts attacking, their idea now is just to play queen e4 and bishop c2. So let's say queen e4 attacking c6, again bishop c2, and white's just threatening to attack on h7. So eventually black's going to have to take this g7 pawn. And here, for instance, if knight takes g7, queen h7 is really scary, king f8, and white can play moves like knight to e5 and just unleash hell on black's kingside position. So here Stockfish captured on g7 with their knight. AlphaZero could take on c4 here, but they decided to play castles queenside. So let's just quickly assess this position. So once white's castle queenside, what's going on? Well, both sides have 6 pawns, but black's got an extra piece. However, black's kingside pawns protecting the king, the g and h pawn have been ripped away from black, and white's just got so many amazing threats coming up, and black's got to be really careful defending this position. And the problem for black is that they've got no concrete plan now. Their concrete plan pretty much is to try and defend their black king position, because any counter attacks on the queen side might be met with mate on the king side. Black's got issues with this bishop and this rook trapped, and this g7 knight is seriously bad. So in the long term, white's prospects look quite good, and in real terms it's going to be really hard for black to defend this position. So there are multiple options that black can play here. So bishop takes c4 is being threatened, so what happens if black plays something like b5 here? Well, white can follow up with queen e4, so threatening to take on c6 for instance. Black again has multiple options here. If they play bishop to b7 to protect the pawn, white can play bishop takes c4. And if they capture, white can just play rook takes g7, so they've connected their rooks, and after king takes, rook g1 check. And again, black's in tremendous trouble here. In fact, they have to block the attack with bishop g5. And after knight takes g5, even though black's actually a rook up here, their king is under tremendous threat, and they're going to lose a lot of material and probably met with mate soon enough. So again, after b5 in this position and queen e4, bishop b7 isn't really an option due to bishop takes c4. f5 was another try, but white can actually just take on e6 with check because this knight's pinned. And if rook f7 to block, queen h6, and white's just getting their pieces into the attack. If rook b8, bishop e2 again to connect the rooks together, and if black starts counter-attacking, Again, rook takes g7 is just a solid move. After rook captures, bishop takes c4, rook f7 and rook g1. With check, black's going to be mated in a few moves. So again, after b5, queen e4. One of the only other moves to defend is maybe knight to f6. But here white can play queen f4, threatening to play queen h6. If black now goes super defensive with knight fe8, white can play knight to e5, threatening to take on c6. And if like a bishop b7, just bishop e2 to connect the rooks once again. Black can play bishop f6, but now white just plays dynamic moves like bishop f3. And if captures, the queen's threatened, so queen c7. And they can play moves like knight to e4, jumping into f6. If black tries to defend with f6, again queen h6 is strong. And after queen captures, white can play moves like knight d6. Again, this is just a long variation, but after f5, bishop h5, black's in some serious trouble after rook f6 and queen g5. And the variation continues with c3, knight takes e8, c takes b2 check and just king d2. And after rook f8, white's in a clearly won position. So actually it's really hard to defend for black. So after castle's queenside, b5 doesn't look like much of an option. f5 was also touted as a move to play here, but white can play bishop takes c4, threatening to take on e6 now. And after knight b6 to attack the bishop and defend e6, white can just drop the bishop back and remain on this nice diagonal. If knight d5, white just now has a simple plan of doubling rooks, so rook g3. If knight takes c3, rook dg1, rook f7 and b takes c3. White's plan is simple, just play knight to e5, f4 and queen g2 here. And even though black's a piece up, it's going to be really hard to stop this attack. That knight on g7 is basically a glorified pawn at this moment in time, and white just has the advantage. So in the game, black actually tries now to get the queen out and use it as a defensive piece to stop white's attack. They play queen a5 here, but now AlphaZero plays bishop takes c4, just gain another pawn back. Queen f5 is played, and AlphaZero's wise play a move like queen e2, defending the knight on f3 and avoiding the queen exchange. Queen h7 is played to defend the position, but maybe it's not enough here. AlphaZero now just continues the attack relentlessly with rook to g3, threatening rook g1, doubling rooks. So Stockfish moves their king off this file. Rook dg1 is played, so now white is threatening to take on g7. So after doubling, what would happen if black now plays rook to g8 here? Well, white can now play knight to e4, where they'll have some nice play. So they're threatening to play knight to g5, and then maybe knight takes f7. So what's black to do here? Because if knight to f5 to stop this, just rook takes g8, queen takes is forced, and rook takes g8 and king takes. White's in a totally won position here. They've got the queen, and black's pieces are really badly developed. In the game, Stockfish played knight to f5 now, attacking the rook on g3. But now AlphaZero found a very clever move. They played queen to f1, threatening rook h3 and trying to pick up the queen. And this is actually unstoppable. So in the game, Stockfish captures the rook on g3, and after rook takes g3, again, they're threatening rook h3, and this is unstoppable. There's no way to defend this. In the game, rook g8 is played, and of course AlphaZero plays rook h3, threatening to take the queen off. Rook g7 is played, and after rook takes h7, they recapture. And after bishop d3, let's just have a look at this position. So white's attacking the rook, and we'll just count some material. White's got 3 pieces, 3 minor pieces. Black's got 3 minor pieces and 2 rooks, and white's got the queen and an extra pawn. So if you count the material up, it's actually dead even. But the difference between the two sides is the dynamic piece play. White's got all their pieces out into nice positions, whereas black has got an open king. That rook is struggling for space, and they're undeveloped on this side of the board with this bad rook and this bad bishop. So to quickly go through how AlphaZero now dismantles the rest of black's position. So Stockfish plays rook g7, queen d1 is played, maybe trying to eye up queen h5 at some point. Knight to f6 is played, so that defends that, but now knight to e5, and white's got a very powerful central piece here, threatening knight's f7 ideas. Bishop d7 is played, and AlphaZero gets the queen back into the attack with queen f3. Rook f8 to defend the f7 square, and now AlphaZero gets their other knight into the position with knight to e2. King g8 to get the king to some relative safety behind the rook. And AlphaZero now just starts consolidating on the other side of the board. They play a3, bishop e8 is played, king b1, a5, and now AlphaZero stops any knight d5 ideas with e4. b5 is played, and bishop c2 from AlphaZero. b4 is played, and now AlphaZero locks down this side of the board. They play a4, king h8, king a2, king g8, and now knight to g3. Stockfish plays rook to g5, and AlphaZero plays queen to d1. After king h8, finally AlphaZero consolidates this side of the board with bishop b3, maybe threatening to sacrifice on e6 or f7 at some point at the right moment. So black retreats their rook back to g7. Queen c2 now attacking the c6 square with the knight and the queen. And how does black stop this? Well, it actually looks impossible to defend that pawn, so black attacks now with knight g4. But after knight takes c6, bishop takes c6 and queen takes c6, black could now start taking pawns with like knight takes f2, let's say. But after queen c7 attacking the bishop, if the bishop moves to g5, white can start guessing in with knight h5, and if rook h7, just queen e5, maybe f6. And frankly, black's struggling now. Queen d6 attacking the rook. Let's say rook moves to, I don't know, let's say a8. White can play knight to f4, and black's king's just really open now. So this e6 pawn is weak, this g6 square is going to be struggling. And if black takes off more pawns, moves like queen c6 can be played. It's just really tricky for black to defend all their like passive pieces. In the game after queen takes c6 though, Stockfish played rook h7, so threatening maybe rook h2. Queen c7, like we had in the previous variation, attacking its bishop. The bishop drops back to d8, and white now pokes more holes with queen f4 attacking the knight. Rook g8 is played, but now white attacks the knight again with bishop d1. The knight retreats, and AlphaZero just shows their superiority here. They play h4, protecting the h2 pawn, knight d7 and h5. So white is just slowly suffocating black's position and blunting this h7 rook. h6 is on the cards as well at some point. Knight f6 is played, d5 now, and if black decides to capture this, after e takes d5, knight takes d5, queen d4 can be played, and after knight to f6, move like knight e4 and just start trading pieces off. If king g7, white can start just putting pressure with queen e5 and asking black the question of where they're going to move to. Queen g5 is a move, and to be honest here, black is just struggling to put their pieces on good squares. The white pieces are really limiting black's play. So after d5, capturing probably wouldn't be a good option. Rook e8 is played by Stockfish though, and after d6 though, black should probably just resign. They just blunted that bishop on d8 really badly, so they've gained the dark squares. Rook g7 is played, h6 and rook h7. So as we see, AlphaZero just absolutely outplayed Stockfish in this endgame due to black's passive pieces, and white's just controlling all the dark squares now. And that rook on h7 is pretty pathetic. e5 now, and after knight d5 we see the total control of white's position. Queen d2, rook g8, bishop b3, and maybe white's preparing to take on d5 at some point, winning more material. Bishop g5 attacking the queen, so the black's got some options, maybe take on h6, queen d1, knight b6 to to move the knight away from the attack. But AlphaZero finishes the game with knight to e4, attacking the bishop on g5. And actually here Stockfish resigns, or it was adjudicated to have lost the game. So why is this? Why resign here? Well, of course, if bishop takes h6, knight f6 is on the cards, attacking the two rooks, so they can't play that. Bishop d8 looks like the only logical move to play. And after a sequence like queen c1, maybe knight d7 and queen f4, I'm not entirely sure where black can go now. Knight f6 is threatened. Queen f7 can be played at some point. Let's say black plays rook g6. Bishop c2 looks very nice indeed. And if black starts trying to capture this pawn, knight g5. And after bishop takes, queen takes. White's attacking the rook on h7. The queen's threatening to play queen d8 check and pick up this knight. So black looks totally busted to me here. So I think in this position, Stockfish 10 actually gives white as clearly winning with a +8 score. And I actually forgot to mention that white has a passed d pawn as well, so that's probably why the evaluation is so high. Anyway, I just thought this is an inspiring game with this g4 idea once again, and I think it's something we should all start trying to incorporate into our games. It's really hard to defend for black. And again, after we see this combination of d takes and rook g1, well, white's just got tremendous attack, and it's always easier to play the attacking side rather than the defensive side. And of course, your own opponents won't play as well as Stockfish does in these type of games. It's definitely worth trying, I would recommend it. Anyway, hope to see you in the next video. Please drop me a like or subscribe to the channel if you want to watch more chess videos in the future. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.